Okay, so I was just saying that kind of my day job at Children Helping Science, it's a platform for studies with infants and young children that take place remotely in those families' homes. A community of about 130 institutions at this point, all using this shared infrastructure stack to conduct these experiments. And my very not secret mission also with this platform is to help find ways for those researchers to do work that's more reproducible and more robust through that shared infrastructure stack and kind of making adjustments whenever we can. And you'll see a little bit of cross-pollination with the data standard here as we're going through. But what I'm going to talk about today is Psych-DS, which is a data standard for data in the behavioral sciences. So I'll go ahead and start my slides here. So why did we get involved in this project in the first place? So this project started a number of years ago at this point at the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Sciences, SIPS, series of hackathons. And one thing that we know to be true about data in psychology, which then I think also bleeds out into a lot of the behavioral sciences, and then including many kinds of studies of behavior in neurosciences and other areas that overlap with other kinds of sort of biometric or biological recordings, is that data in psychology often can start in non-standardized or non-standardizable formats rather than necessarily machine recordings, or maybe something like that in combination with machine recordings. So depending on the context of the research, this could include paper forms, raw video files that are then going to be coded by hand, even when we're talking about machine produced data streams, we're looking at outputs that are really instrumentation specific. We often have survey instruments, especially that might be coming from a particular company, and maybe those are providing data that's fixed in a particular format. We've written our own code to produce these. We've kind of hack together our own systems for this. And one of the things that I think characterizes the problem in this part of the domain, which I think is a little bit different to some of the problems that the neuroscience communities have faced, is that compared to both work in the biosciences and then kind of going in another direction in the parts of the social sciences that work with like big administrative data sets like from the government, these are often relatively small data sets. Like to give you an idea, in developmental psychology, you might have, let's say, 60 participants, all of whom are going to make 4 forced choices on 16 trials, right? Which, that's, you can't fit it all on a single page of your laptop, but it's also like you could scroll through that in not too long. You can get an idea of what you're looking at your data set with your eyes, right? And my impression is that this is one of the things that has meant that there's just sort of less pressure as the individual scientist to automate your workflow, because if you try really hard and at the expense of a lot of worry and a lot of having to redo your work and a lot of potential for those human errors, you can get by without an automated workflow, right? And there's less, as an individual scientist working on just one project at a time, I think that many of us kind of get like kind of longer into our careers or farther into our first and second and third projects before kind of seeing the benefit of more automated workflows. So that's one of the reasons that I can give to sort of try to account for how different all these data sets manage to look, despite the fact that they're often relatively small compared to the data sets that people in other domains might be dealing with. But despite that sort of lack of internal motivation, we have lots of external motivations to want to be standardizing our data sets and making them in formats that are more amenable to machine-driven pipelines. We have mandates coming from our funders that are asking us to do more sharing than we've been used to doing. When we start to need to coordinate between data sets that are being created, say, on multiple sites in a collaboration, or when we have multiple different data sets that we need to match observations across, being able to smoothly integrate and merge data sets becomes something that's more of an issue, or being able to just understand the data sets that we're getting between ourselves. And then particularly of interest to the BPQS community, I know, is when we start to looking at trying to synchronize data that comes from multiple different streams, whether that's kind of multiple streams along a same time course, whether that's data at multiple levels. Let's say that there's fMRI data paired with phenotypical data about an individual, paired with maybe behavioral data on that same individual done outside of the scanner. where you start to need to be able to deal with data that may be produced by a whole team of scientists, each with their own kind of different ways of working with data. We're increasingly interested in sharing our data with other people, but one of the things that really was important to us as we were starting to design Psych-DS was the knowledge that because this is human data, broadly speaking, that we're working with, many of us have full data sets that cannot be shared openly in their entirety for either ethical or practical reasons. This is an issue, I think, especially when we're thinking about data sharing. You might not necessarily think like, why is data sharing related to data standards? But when you have unstandardized data, one way that I've talked about this is that, it's essentially like you have an entire radioactive room as opposed to having like a small radioactive container. If your data is undocumented, if your data is essentially a black box, you don't know which part of your data is the part that has the really critical private information that you're afraid of sharing. And so then you default to sharing none of it because you have a sense that somewhere in your data set is something that you need to be cautious of, but you don't know where. And if you want to do something like apply data scrambling or something like differential privacy, if you don't have a clear understanding of what's inside your different data set, maybe if your data set's not even that amenable to being read into an analytical script, it's going to be very difficult to even apply that kind of method to a data set when it's not being stored in a format that can be easily managed. So sorry, I just got another bullet point that I already said what I meant to say there. One of the ways that I like to get across the kind of problems that we're trying to solve with Psych-DS, especially when I'm presenting to a kind of more technically sophisticated audience like this, where you might be sort of sitting here thinking to yourself, well, like, okay, yeah, I know that there might be problems, but like, as long as you do something reasonable with your CSVs, we should be good, right? So what I like to do to kind of get across the problem that I think that speaking for myself personally, these are things that I deal with and that I have dealt with as I've learned how to work with data. It's something that my colleagues deal with. It's a series of questions that I think that many of us face really, really broadly. And I think that when you become more technically sophisticated, it can be easy to lose track of how broad and challenging some of these problems can be. I like to present kind of the scope of the challenges that we're facing in contrast to this really beautiful set of recommendations that Broman and Wu make in this paper called Data Organization in Spreadsheets. I'm just going to put up the set of recommendations that you make and invite you to sort of reflect on the idea that every one of these recommendations is being given because these authors, along with many of us, either in ourselves or in other contexts, every one of these recommendations is being given because it is being flouted in many data sets, right? So maybe you didn't start out meaning to represent any particular aspect of your data set in color, but as you were going through it, as you were cleaning it, maybe it just made sense to highlight the rows of your spreadsheet that you needed to pay special attention to in a particular color. And now you've got color representing information in your data set. Maybe you know what your data basically means because you're all working on a same team together. And as far as you can tell, your data column names are perfectly straightforward. So why would you make a data dictionary? Right? Every one of these recommendations is being given for the reason that these are things that it is not automatically obvious why a person should do one of these things. And maybe be consistent is probably maybe the most self-evident of the ones that's in here. But there's as working scientists, we have a lot to learn. There's kind of no particular reason to expect that people are going to automatically know how to do these things. And so in the world of data sets in the wild, when you actually start going out and asking people to, I find you have to do this in person, like pop open your laptop and show me what your data looks like right now on your computer. You start to really find a very wide variety of decisions that people are making for reasons that are good and make sense in the context that there are. And I want to say that again, and I'm probably going to say it a lot of times, nobody sets out to represent their data in ways that make them work slowly and with lots of errors and in ways that are difficult to reproduce. They make decisions that make sense given the resources and the knowledge that they have at the times they make, and then they get stuck doing things in ways that kind of continue to make sense to them. One of the, I think, fundamental challenges with a set of recommendations like this is that if I put a data set in front of you right now, you don't have a way to know whether your data set succeeds in following this very good set of recommendations unless you actually open up the data set and look. I know this is probably an audience that doesn't need to be convinced of the merits of having validators for your standards. But because what we're doing here is looking at some of kind of the really foundational skills or the foundational techniques that are going to let people access machine readable data sets. The importance of validation here is, I think, kind of both a little bit easier to miss when we're talking about rules like you should put your data in a CSV, but also really vital because many of the mistakes that people make are going to be the types of mistakes where you kind of can't even necessarily get off the ground to try to get started, right? Because it's going to kind of like your data is going to be kind of like so far out of the norm of what someone might be expecting that they can't necessarily get started. All right, so I said a little bit about the history of Psych-DS. One thing that I wanted to mention is that we are very, very heavily inspired by the BID specification and community. A lot of times when we've been looking at kind of, should our next steps be, or what kind of tools do we want to develop, we've been really explicitly looking to the BIDS community experience and kind of some of the different choices that that project has made over the course of its development. With kind of, any deviations that we make that you guys think are unwise, we'll kind of take, we'll take full responsibility for those. And in this initial hackathon, I kind of mentioned some of the things that we were interested in. The community enthusiasm around this standard has been kind of particularly keen around making sure that it's accessible for scientists who are not coding experts. I've mentioned this a little bit. And the scope of what we think we're looking at is data where we're making measurements at the level of the person or an organism. If that's not the primary kind of grain of data that you're looking at, that's at least kind of an important access. And we share an interest in this being potentially human data because of the interests around privacy and sharing. People who can't share their entire data sets want to be able to share something where they're able to say, hey, there's a full private data set that I can't show you, but I can tell you that there's this series of steps that I take to produce this data set, which could be a partial data set, could even be just as minimal as the metadata, letting you know, like, this is the part that I can share, this is the variables and the information that is available. If you, take the proper steps that are going to allow you to access the private version of the data, give you a really good sense of what you'd be able to see there. Specifically, the work that we've been able to do more recently, kind of starting in like 2023, 24, is funding from the NIH Brain Initiative, which is directed in particular towards implementing a validator and creating a series of tools that are kind of, close to and around that. Looking at community and adoption of those standards. We all kind of know how important it is that people are able to actually kind of pick up and use the standard in order to start kind of kicking its tires and figure out the places where it's actually not serving the purposes that we hope it will serve and make those updates that we need to. And again, kind of bringing it back around to the Brain Initiative, focusing on places where we might be able to integrate with other existing neuroscience data standards, maybe especially in the context of projects where you may have psychologists or cognitive scientists or other kinds of people who are doing primarily behavioral work working alongside people who are working with neurophys or neuroimaging or other kinds of neuroscience data. So again, just to preview, or if people want to be taking a look behind the scenes as I'm talking, I'm very happy and very grateful to Brian Leonard, the engineer who's working on this project and who's here today, that we have a live validator that you can test out. It's currently available at this URL. And as, again, you'll probably wind up saying this a lot of times, as is true for the BID specification, the validator is the ground truth of the specification. It makes what we mean, what we say by various bits of the rules of the data standard concrete. But the other thing that I really want to emphasize here is that it gives a success metric for individual researchers. We've given you all this advice about how you really ought to be dealing with your data to make it reproducible, to make it, amenable to machine-driven workflows. But if you're not really sure whether you succeeded or not, or maybe if you're thinking of sharing a data set and you're not sure if your data is right, or if you're doing a good job preparing it for sharing, this is intended to function as a success metric. If it passes the validator, we want to be able to say this is data that is pretty well formatted for somebody else who's coming into it to be able to start to understand the structure of what they're going to find there. So we had a little bit of a preview of this with the Broman and Wu slides. But I'm going to give you kind of a few views of what the Psych-DS standard actually covers. one of the kind of first ways that we can think about it is by a pretty short list of common sense rules that we are asking you to maintain. The first rule is we're going to ask you to separate the data of your scientific project from other files about your project, whether that's analysis files or graphs or writing or materials. Put your data in a single location in your storage, and don't destructively modify your data. Keep it in an individual spot. Yes, Yarek, yes, it is. And we'll come back to the schema in a minute. Thanks for the specificity there. I appreciate it. So we are going to separate our data from other files. We are going to use file name conventions that are regular, machine friendly. We're not going to use color. We're going to use simple text-based formats. We're going to ask for a README. But we're going to combine those common sense rules with metadata that's in a format that's designed to integrate with more complex ontologies and data specifications. So it's a JSON-LD metadata. You may be, if you're a JSON-LD nerd, you may find yourself a little bit disappointed in this talk because we're just simply not going to use kind of all of the power that's available to the JSON-LD format. We're providing potentially kind of the most minimal version of that, but that's going to give us the ability to kind of link into these bigger systems. And again, to come back to this, usability is really, really key for us. We're hopefully coming in for adoption by scientists who have a wide range of technical backgrounds. Maybe they're learning their first programming language, or maybe they don't know any programming language currently, but they'd like to. Maybe they've never opened their terminal. But hopefully they're going to find this as something that they can adopt. And fingers really crossed, something that they're going to be able to adopt while making kind of the minimal number of changes to their workflows that we can. Whenever we have kind of a choice between things that we could include in the standard, we'll often be asking ourselves, what is more likely to be a smaller change from what the researchers are currently doing. So Psych-DS covers directory and file name structure. We are trying here to encourage good practices for project organization, while also handling the presence of raw data that we can't actually convert into a Psych-DS compliant form. So non-tabular raw data like video, photographs of paper forms that people filled out. I'm using like examples from my own research past here. Potentially something that's in maybe you've got machine output that you want to preserve in its original form, which is a very good instinct, but to then have it alongside the data that's going to be more compatible with other data that you might want to combine it with. In terms of the files that are inside of that data, we're going to ask them to be CSVs with a header row. Nothing particularly revolutionary here, but also not what many people are going to be starting out with. And then the metadata structure, again, we strive to avoid reinventing the wheel where possible. We're using the schema.org dataset schema. And then we are going to be implementing the LinkML schema, which we'll show you a little bit of here. The idea here is that we are trying to make this accessible to our novice users, but hopefully still, kind of providing the access to these more powerful technologies. So this is Psych-DS in a single slide. You don't need to try to understand it right now. I'll try to break it down for you a little bit here. But if you have interacted with the BIDS standard, this is probably going to look fairly familiar. There are like papers that you can find written just about this practice right here of saying within your project, separate out your analysis from your data from your other materials. That's not a practice that all researchers are following right now today. In fact, many of them are not necessarily, all having all of their materials from a single project inside of a single folder, right? That may be because they are required to have kind of multiple storage solutions. Maybe they have very large data that they're incorporating from somewhere, but also just because this is, it turns out this is a very good way to organize your data, but it's not the only way that somebody might organize their materials for a scientific project. But we're going to ask you to, I put this up to sort of to show you kind of the context that we expect that Psych-DS is going to be used in. Psych-DS, however, is basically going to ignore everything that isn't the data set. Right, so it's going to be looking for within a project, we're looking for a JSON file. So essentially declaring like this is the area of influence that we should be looking for, and then looking for a data folder, and we're going to be interested in everything that's inside of that data folder. Oh, look, I put arrows to show you some of those things. Sorry about that. Within each of those CSVs, we're going to expect to find this regular structure, as I mentioned. A reminder that CSVs are simple, they're text-based. This is going to be adjustment. I think this is one of the things that is a big adjustment for people who, for instance, are, longtime Excel users. And expect when they see something like the top framework to have more power rather than just kind of the simple text version there. We expect a header row, and then the only thing other than that header row to be the data. And one of the things that's key here for Psych-DS is that unlike BIDS and unlike, I think, some of the other standardization approaches, we are going to make almost no assumptions about what the structure of the data is. When we started working on this project, even within our, smallish group of maybe I think it was like 15 to 20 people at that point, we started out thinking, well, surely sessions are nested within people. And then our relationship researcher said, well, no, actually, each of my sessions contains 2 people, right? So we don't, for instance, we do enforce naming conventions that's very similar to BIDS. So we say you want to cluster, however your files differ from each other, we're going to use this key value structure to cluster things according to the groups that they belong to. But we're not going to assume that subjects are inside of sessions or sessions are inside of subjects. We're going to assume that your experiment may have files that could correspond to all different kinds of levels of representation. And we're going to leave it up to you as the researcher to decide kind of what are the appropriate groupings to be putting your data into. But all that being said, at the end of the day, no matter how many different kinds of no matter how many different kind of particular structures you have here. So in this example data set, we have, kind of a single summary data file at the top, and then 3 subject-specific data files that have parallel structure to each other. However many of those there are, they all need to fit this kind of common piece of metadata. This is a complete metadata object right here. So like I said, it can be extremely minimal. So in this case, just showing all we have here is a name, a description, and then in the smallest version of the variable object version, it's just an array of the names of the columns here. And so what's critical here, and where we start getting into the validation that I think provides more power for the specification for people who are going to be using it, is that if there is a variable measured name in the metadata, then that is expected to appear somewhere in at least one of the CSVs. And conversely, if there's a header column in any of the CSVs anywhere, then that header is expected to appear in the list of variables. And we're going to throw an error if that's not the case. So I'm going to show you like a very not live demo of this. So what I'll do right now is I'll show you some screenshots from the validator. If we're feeling very brave, we might try some live validation later on in the talk, but I'm just going to sort of show you briefly what the validator is doing kind of as of right now. So for the purposes of this data, what I want to show you here is essentially this is essentially a data set that is pretty close, but it's not quite meeting the Psych-DS specification yet. So for instance, in this case, the data is in a tab separated format rather than a CSV. There is a metadata object that's present, but if you were to open it up, you would actually see that there are fields missing from it. There's a README that's in a weird spot, which the validator is going to complain about because it's not a CSV. And so if you wanted to find out if this folder were on your local laptop, what you would do is you'd navigate your regular old web browser to this URL, click on this Choose Files button. Again, our users are very privacy oriented, and so we've got this nice big message right up here letting you know that you're not actually uploading everything. Everything here is client side. If you want to, you can navigate to this web page and then turn your Wi-Fi off and it'll still work. But you'll be able to select the folder that your data is present in. If you're not sure what to do, or if your data set is very far away from this format, you can get started with our documentation, which is going to walk you through the process of starting with however your data might be, and kind of helping you to get your data hopefully kind of rough draft into shape so that when you start running the validator, the errors that you get are hopefully going to be pretty informative. But at any rate, you're going to come back to here, choose your folder that you're going to validate. In most cases, you're going to get told the first time off that your data set is invalid. But something that we were hoping for, and one of the things that Brian has implemented really nicely here, is that we're going to give you some input about kind of how far you've gotten and how far away you are from getting this data validated to the full specification. And so for the example that I was showing you earlier, we've figured out where our project folder is. In fact, we found that there was a dataset description file in the root folder, and there was a data subfolder, right? So we've hit our two main things already. And then the first thing we're going to do is to try to parse the dataset description file, see if everything is what we need. No, in fact, something is missing. And so hopefully this is going to tell you as the user, okay, the first thing that I'm going to need to do is to stop and go look at that. One of the things that I want to point out here, and this really, speaks to a lot of Brian's efforts, is that this is a little bit of a lie. The validator doesn't actually proceed in the order that's shown here. A lot of things here are happening, over a tree that's, searching the entire file structure across. But hopefully we're able to sort of linearize it as we present it to people so that they're not presented first with an error message that doesn't really make sense in context. The hope is that however far you get, the first error message that you're going to be seeing is one that makes sense to you, and it's something that you're able to address kind of right away. And then hopefully the idea here is that you can make iterative changes to that. Maybe you changed your TSV into a CSV, you opened up your dataset description JSON file, and you figured out that there was a comma missing that wasn't letting it be parsed. And then eventually, hopefully you get to validation. And again, if your file validates, then it meets the Psych-DS standard. A suggestion from Austin, a validation failure, including a link to upstream documentation for the specific requirement. Yeah, Brian might be able to talk a little bit about this, but because of the LinkML structures that we're using to run this validator, that's definitely something that we're looking at. Every one of these errors is, in fact, tied to a specific rule in the schema. So sorry, maybe I will stop there and ask if people have questions. I just have a couple more slides here before we go on. I'll say a little bit about kind of where we are in the project and how we're hoping to implement this and hopefully drive adoption. Since Psych-DS doesn't enforce a specific structure of sessions or subjects, is the local structure in the dataset description or otherwise machine readable somehow? So the answer is no. The local structure is very much up to the researcher. So if they want to have a flat data file where all of the CSVs are, right at the top level of the data folder, that's something that they can do. If they have a very nested structure, maybe this is, coming out of some custom written experiment code. Maybe it's coming out of some custom experiment code, like maybe it's creating a folder for every participant, or maybe it's creating a folder for every trial, and then data, or objects are nested within that. The validator will crawl the entire tree and look at all of the CSVs that it finds. We advise, but obviously we can't enforce that people should put their key value pairs into a logical order. But that's something that we hope that people will be doing, kind of using key value pairs that are descriptive, and so hopefully represent the structure of the data. Things like looking for more specific structures that reflect specific experimental paradigms or specific kind of field ontologies or field specific ways of structuring data is something that we kind of explicitly have sort of carved off as thinking about something that's for standards that may want to build on top of this. And then Raj is asking a question here about the summary data set, what it might contain and what its purpose is. So if we're going back to this single page CSV here. So the idea here is that, so this is a pretend data set. This data doesn't really exist. But an example where this might come up might be a case where each participant carries out several trials where they give a response. So then maybe first I build a single data file for every participant where I've got a column over here that says, the ID that I've assigned for that participant. Then there's the trial ID, and then their response on that trial. This could be like reaction time data or something like that. And then as I'm collecting my data, as I'm managing the data that's coming in, maybe I then also have data that's at the level of the participant. So in addition to studies, in addition to a data file that's, each participant's separate file and then data per row at the level of the trial, we could also then have data that's at the level of the participant. Maybe it turns out that we need a summary data set here, data file that has a single row per participant. W2A1 has their file over here. FDS 11, AA 65 might have another data file down here where I'm learning, the age and years and whether they responded to a follow-up questionnaire, for instance. Tegraj, does that answer your question, or am I completely off base?
Yes, it answered.
Okay.
I just wanted to understand like the reason behind like creation of the separate file.
So one of the things that became clear as we started kind of looking at each other's data sets in the kind of early stages of doing this is that decisions about whether to put things into one file or to split them across multiple files, and whether to favor kind of, really, really long rows with lots of kind of structured information versus really, 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 really wide data sets versus really, really long ones with like kind of much more sort of granular entries is extremely idiosyncratic. People vary really, really widely in what seems natural to them, and there are not really any field-wide kind of shared instincts about whether one of these is really the right way to do things or not. So it's very commonly the case that you'll see a data set and your first question is, why in the world is this all split up into all these million data sets? Or why in the world did they try to cram all of this information into a single data file? Right. And the answer is that, people's minds work differently, people's workflows work differently. And often it's a combination of just kind of what seems natural to somebody and the particular workflow by which the data is collected. Like, is each data collection event, a minute and you're not going to talk to an entire class worth of people and walk away with 17 different participants, or is each participant, a day-long interview with somebody, right? All of those kinds of things really influence how people structure their data, and it makes it extremely, extremely idiosyncratic. And is part of the reason that we sort of wound up backing off to the project of let's try to convince people that putting their data into CSVs is worthwhile. And trying to sort of move people a useful step, hopefully toward being able to support integration with data sets that maybe another group of researchers had produced. Okay, so I can say just a little bit about where we are in this project. Again, we had sort of like a big round of kind of community input to generate the kind of written specification. Oh, I got another question. Can the summaries? Yes, the summaries can be further nested. You can have absolutely any representation of the data that you want. If you can fit it in your like local file system. I guess maybe one thing to say here is the sort of imagined user of Psych-DS is someone who can fit their data on their local machine. Purely that's because that's the type of that's where the group of people who created it. There's nothing that would prohibit you from trying to use something like this for data that, for instance, you needed to stream from cloud storage somewhere because it's so large, but it's also certainly not optimized for that. Absolutely, you could you could create separate files for trial IDs. We're not controlling the structure of the data that's inside of it. We're just controlling that it be in a CSV and not an Excel file. That it be in a CSV that contains a header row followed by the data. You don't get, if you've used Qualtrics to collect survey data, for instance, they get a little bonus row that's like the second row of every CSV is for essentially like a small data dictionary. We're going to learn about like what was the question that was being asked. So yeah, kind of any format that you want. And Yaroslav, there's not, so far the collection of data sets is just the example data sets that you see there. One of the things that this grant has funded and that has actually already been implemented is that every user of Children Helping Science now downloads a valid Psych-DS formatted data set, right? So people who already have their data sets in Psych-DS don't have to go through the trouble of getting their data sets formatted that way. And so it is our hope that people are going to be starting to share them, because they have real data sets to share. And one of the things that's coming up for us also is kind of a bigger project of collecting data sets of people's, work as they're starting to use the specification in the course of their projects. We forked the BIDS 2.0 validator, so I hope that answers some questions about link-ML schema and kind of the structure of what we consider to be the ground truth of Psych-DS. We are hoping dearly to be able to kind of ride this project's coattails forward to not have to double implement the specification into multiple languages, but to kind of instead do that work of needing to represent the schema and then build, for instance, R packages and things like that that make reference to that schema. One of the things that I wanted to mention also, I mentioned a little bit about how we are pretty explicitly not digging too far into field specific or kind of really method specific restrictions or terminology. Part of the reason for that is that we hope that this gives a community kind of a first step toward being able to do that. If you have a community of researchers who are primarily working in Excel notebooks that, are full of, really good science, but presented in a kind of a world of mystery, the hope here is that if you could get that community to kind of first get your data sets in Psych-DS, that you're then able to, be able to just very basically crawl through those and start to discover, okay, how did we structure our data? What are the Kline elements that are coming up over again that we want to start to control more specifically, that we want to kind of build an ontology around? One of the examples also that we've thought about for this that you might be able to do is, again, like if you have, let's say, a behavioral instrument that's sitting alongside BIDS imaging data sets, if you need to, let's say, calculate measures over the behavioral, if you need to calculate analyses over the behavioral measures, it may potentially be really inconvenient to do that in the context of a big BIDS directory. And so there's probably some value to being able to just kind of extract the behavioral part, do whatever analyses that you need to do, or to share just that piece with a collaborator without having to share that much bigger and potentially more sensitive imaging data. And then conversely, to be able to bring back that data that maybe was collected on an instrument that wasn't synchronized with your scanner, and it just exists as a completely separate data object, but then you want to be able to inject it, into a BIDS format. So those are, again, I guess some examples of places that we're kind of hoping that this might be useful. I think that is all of my slides. Oh, and then just finally again, and thanks so much for having me here, David. This is kind of exactly the kind of thing that we're hoping for with the NIH programming. Again, this is funded through the BRAIN Initiative. And so just sort of in developing the standard, it's kind of an exciting way for us to be able to interact with more neuroscientific data, start to learn more about how we can integrate here. And then also, I'm involved in the BBQS project. We are one of a substantial handful of standards that's basically intended to be available for BBQS scientists to use as appropriate. And the stage that we're in right now is that we're starting to collect information from those researchers about the types of data that they collect so that we can start to sort of do that matchmaking and find out. I think one of the things I'm especially expecting is that Psych-DS may be really useful sort of in edge cases where you've got something where, 90% of my data is really, really well served by Neurodata Without Borders or something like that. But then I also have this other bit of like, administrative data or this other kind of chunk that doesn't really fit. And so maybe then you're going to, represent that in this much lighter weight kind of approach. And thank you to members of our kind of hackathon community, and especially to Brian, who has built this validator. And I hope that we do have a few more minutes for questions. I'm happy to take questions kind of in any direction that people are interested in.
That's great. Thank you so much. Oh, a picture of Tal, good friend of our community, and hadn't seen him in a while. Anyway,
yeah, super helpful for getting started. Yeah.
So the first low-level question is: can Psych-DS represented data be included in BIDS anywhere? Does that break BIDS at the moment?
So here's what I would say with that. Psych-DS datasets can potentially be completely unconstrained and contain absolutely anything. And I wouldn't want to make BIDS responsible for needing to do that. Right? Like if I'm going to come in and say like, hey, guess what? This is this is, I don't know, polling results. This is This is GIS data of election results across the United States. I don't want to make bids, which for some reason is also linked to an individual level. I don't want to make bids responsible for representing that, right? But if it is the case that the information present in Psych-DS is the kind of information that belongs in a bids data set, like let's say it's phenotypical data about the individual, then yes, we want to be able to say, hey, if you have an appropriate data set with the kind of information that you want inside of bids, then yes, we should be able to tell you, hey, as long as your Psych-DS data set has these properties, in fact, here's a converter that's going to let you put that kind of thing into a bids directory tree in the spots where it appropriately belongs.
So something would have to convert the Psych-DS version into whatever it is that you're allowed to put in a bids phenotype file or something.
Exactly.
Which I don't know the details of, but if
Right,
it could just be Psych-DS, wouldn't that be nice? Yeah.
I was going to say, well, but probably what we would do is we would be looking at the bid standard to say like, hey, like if the Psych-DS data that you have doesn't have these particular columns or doesn't have these particular qualities that bids requires, then no, I'm not going to do that conversion. But if it does, then we're going to attempt it. And then vice versa, we're not going to try to represent everything in bids in a Psych-DS data set. But when we look at kind of, creating a little distillator for the behavioral data, I suspect we're going to, again, like as with the validator, we pick a very, very small chunk of all of the many, many things that bids is covered to focus on.
Great, thanks. JB has his hand up. I know Yarrick has written some stuff. But go ahead, JB.
He has more to say than me. No, it's a fantastic talk, really, really cool because those data come up absolutely everywhere, and and so it's a very fundamental talk, I would say. How about not two things, I guess. One is there is in bits the data dictionary. Is not compulsory, but has some sort of a structure given to it, and basically on the same line of thought as Dave, how do we combine those two things in a most efficient way? So the data dictionary, so bit one is not just an LD, it's just a simple JSON one that can be then sort of LDified. But a second, the substantial question may be, do you have recommended sort of ontologies or ways of doing some URIs on those column terms and possibly on those cells, male, female, whatever flows through. And that is there a branch of that project that goes in that direction, which would be a useful thing for a number of our projects. ReproNim-ish.
So what I'll say about that is that so the kind of the first and easier answer about the data dictionaries is that I mentioned here that this is the simplest form of the variable measured object. The type here is an array of strings. Variable measured, excuse me, can also be an array of JSON objects, which are themselves the schema.org, I think they're property type objects, which can then have things like minimum and maximum values. The variable measured, excuse me, yes. So rather than a single, each variable measured has a number of properties that it can take on. Variable measured is a controlled term. It's not variable measured at schema.org doesn't have everything that you might want for instance, column validation. But it's got a good start, and it's, obviously, like, of course, it's possible to define additional things on there. So if you wanted to represent a data dictionary in Psych-DS, the most kind of Psych-DS-y way to do so would be to do it in the context of that dataset description file. And then, ideally, we'll also be providing tools that are going to let you convert that into something that's a little bit more human readable as well. As for specific ontologies, again, because this is JSON LD, yes, if you want to do the work to attach external URIs to a particular variable, you can absolutely do so. I'm less sure about values within columns. That's a good question.
The common data element,
we were discussing that.
Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, I imagine that it's doable, but we're getting further and further outside of my own expertise in terms of machine represented ontologies. But I suspect that it would be doable. We have not done it, and it's not part of our current project. But we're very happy to think about collaborations for doing that work, because this is kind of designed to be supportable for that.
Yeah, I think that's really is will be super useful to kind of combine that those efforts with the whatever BIDS is going to come up with the data dictionary or the description file for the participant.tsv file. Yeah, that sounds like so really so useful to have the same thing for maintenance and for plenty of reasons. But I think it's really worth seeing. The scope seems to be extremely close. So finding the same tools if we have the same scope, I think I don't know. Jarek might have more to say on the bid side of things, but it sounds like it would be such a good idea.
Speaking of Yark, he wrote some questions, but maybe he shall speak them.
That would be great.
Well, to a degree, it was addressed, right? So this mapping between bits and Psych-DS, and one of the aspects was like, oh, we cannot just take anything and stick it into bits. Well, we can. It just will not be validated, right? You could stick it and bits ignore, right? But that's not, then you don't benefit from any validation. And that's maybe the question, should we allow for generic data type kind of table? Like you have this underscore data CSV, or we would have TSV, right? And just allow, because we have already ways to describe those TSV. And then it's a question, just for each subject to allow those agnostic data TSVs, right? That would be one.
Sure.
Then second aspect, harmonization, like you call it analysis in bits, we call it code, right?
Sure.
Materials, it's like I didn't yet grasp what materials are, but probably maybe like source data or something. So this mapping to
it could be stimuli also.
So it's in bits we have it formalized into stimuli, right?
Okay.
And there is BEP which describe it. So could we establish such mapping so people could come, bits, they know that this stuff is here, and it's Psych-DS, it's there, and then could we create converters between the two? Kind of. That was the idea. Could they be both sufficiently expressive to represent, obviously Psych-DS cannot represent everything bits does, but at least I hope bits could potentially represent everything that Psych-DS could contain. Maybe not necessarily validate. That's another aspect, like what aspects of validation we could maybe benefit from what you've learned by doing Psych-DS. Like, why did you go for CSV versus TSV, which is like divergence, which not obvious to me why we do it.
User testing.
User testing, that's right.
Yes, I've had many people attempt to create CSVs who are not used to creating CSVs, and I've had people attempt to create TSVs who are not used to creating them. People who are asked to create CSVs out of, let's say, Google Sheet or out of Excel succeed not well, but okay with CSV and fail utterly trying to make TSVs because it's more button clicks and it's hidden away inside menus, and they like need help to get past that step. This is like Psych-DS very explicitly has kind of like pedagogical goals, and we are trying really, really hard not to scare people off by barriers where it's not kind of obvious why they're failing.
Right. Another aspect, let's say, which levels, like you have this study and subject entities, we call it in bits, right? What other entities you found useful, right? Maybe that's what we should introduce in bits as well. And study is one of those, and center and whatnot. We also considering for bits to O effort, how could we maybe make it flexible? So for a specific data set, you would say, it's study subject, not subject as the leading entity. Right, so all those lessons could be potentially useful to cross-pollinate.
Great, and specifically here, we don't require either identity. You can make up whatever you want here. We have a suggested list to get people started, but you're free to invent whatever key value pairs you want in whatever order you want. So if there's interest in kind of providing a similar mode, like Brian has implemented that, right? So that's a very concrete thing that's available, I guess. And in terms of which ones are useful, that's something that I hope that we will kind of continue to learn as we get more adoption.
Right. Another aspect, let's say, I call it context, but it's not context. How to define the scope, let's say, of those subject IDs? You have multiple projects, right? Is this subject ID, which is referenced also in other projects? I'm not talking about de-anonymization, but rather really like, oh, you know, you have full subjects. How do you identify any of the IDs, give them a scope? It's like pretty much context within, you know, LD context, right? It's, you could say prefix for this subject ID is this center, right? So it's kind of, oh, this subject ID is specific to that center. And then you could use data more efficiently because you could use the data from multiple data sets. Is that something you looked into?
No, not explicitly. That's the kind of thing that's very much up to the user. Essentially, there's no, like, this isn't the kind of thing that the validator can enforce, but the validator assumes that if you use a column called sub ID, it's going to mean the same thing across files, and that, you know, if we're going to give you like a list of unique values that are present, we're going to give you like a single list, right? We're going to assume that WTA1 is the same thing in if it's present in multiple files, right?
Sure, in this data set, and what I'm talking about across data sets. Yeah, like how to link them across data sets.
Oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I can imagine wanting to be able to do something like automatically combining multiple Psych-DS data sets into a single one, for instance.
Or splitting apart and recombining, right? It's something like that.
Yeah. We haven't looked into that. That sounds really cool. Let's see. Austin asks about how Psych-DS helps with the radioactive box problem. Oh yeah, this isn't on this version of this. So the sort of the idiomatic recommendation for your original data, whether that's some Excel files, whether it's private data that you know that you won't be able to share, whatever else, is to put that in a folder called raw data inside of your data, right? So, you know, and you're gonna have a subfolder of data called raw data, and then inside that is kind of your original form. And then the idea is that somebody who's maybe creating this from scratch by hand can then kind of populate out data that they intend to share or data that's kind of more ready for presentation. So one way that you could think about this radioactive box problem is you could use, you know, we have a Psych-DS ignore file where you say, you know, hey, these are the subfolders of my data that shouldn't be covered by Psych-DS. Or now that I've put my data in this format and I've corralled all of my private data into one place, I know which data are present. I can now feel more confident when I choose to share that, hey, if I get rid of that one subfile, I've done the thing that I mean to do. If you like, part of the radioactive box problem is really just sort of being solved by moving researchers to a place where they could do a machine-driven, reproducible production of a shareable data set, right? Like if you have data in a format like this, now it's the kind of thing that you can write an R script and say, hey, give me a version of this data set that never contains the birthday column, right? Like where that's not possible to do in a reproducible way if you're, you know, sitting on top of a bunch of unformatted or unknown formatted data.
Thanks. I see JB's hand. I'll get to him in just a second. I want to thank people who have to leave at 3 for joining us, and to insert a reminder here that next month, March 7, we have Leonard Wickham, who's one of the ReproNim fellows, maybe a past fellow, who will be talking about his work. So that's a new hand, JB, and so I will give you the next question.
A very quick question on how many data sets do you know and do are actually, you know, Psych-DS standards? I mean, and the subsequent question is, how is quickly evolving, and is the standard really sort of set in stone now, or is it still in the phase of like early development and can still evolve? I mean, basically, same question, different angle.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that it is reasonably, I would say it's not set in stone, but it's set in like Jello or something like that, in the sense that just because of the way that my career has gone, there was kind of a big push. We sort of put together the human readable version of the standard. Then there was a gap of 3 or 4 years, and then we kind of produced the validator, and now are looking at tool building and getting back to adoption. We're also working with, so people are familiar with JS Psych, the language for writing experiments in. We're working with JS Psych and then also with PsychoPy to provide Psych-DS downloads out of those tools. so that people who use tools like that can kind of get data sets like these for free. We have not started, so we've implemented it on CHS because like I also run that code base, so it's really easy to do. But are kind of just coming up to the point where we're going to be working with JS Psych and PsychoPy. So essentially, this is a really good time for us to take feedback. If there are really, really obvious things that we shouldn't leave on the table because they're going to provide like, you know, a bunch of really good value for integrating with bids or for like there's work that's out of scope for us around ontologies and other kind of linked data stuff. But if there are places where we want to kind of leave the hooks so that work can be done in the future more effectively, like this is the right time to kind of to find those spots. So I think maybe that gives a good impression of where we're at.
Yeah, no, I think it does answer. It is the right time to like see if there's something that has to be done with leads in particular. I think that's my okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Because managing the release of a new version of those things is is the problem. Like,
yeah.
So, yeah.
Great. Again, thank you. Any last burning questions? Hearing none, I would like to thank the attendees and thank Melissa. And again, as part of the larger BBQS infrastructure and how that interacts with ReproNim, we will all be chatting further and further as these things go along.
Okay, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.